Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff on the NewsHour tonight. The news of this Monday. Then, what's the right energy policy? Opposing views from the presidential campaigns. The latest on the Anthrax investigation. A health unit report on the challenges Beijing's smoggy air poses for Olympic athletes. And remembering Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the author who chronicled the Gulag, Soviet prison camps.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer is provided by...
We are explorers. Humans are. Today there is a new frontier to explore. Energy. We're trying to find it in ways once unimaginable, mapping uncharted territory 5 miles below the sea, long before a single mark is ever put in the ground. So we drill more intelligently, more respectfully, to power the new explorers. This is the power of human energy.
Pacific Life.
The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, working to solve social and environmental problems at home and around the world.
And with the ongoing support of these institutions and foundations. And
this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The price of oil today dropped to its lowest point in 3 months. It was driven down again, partly by falling demand. The closing price in New York was near $121.40 a barrel, off nearly 3%. It's down 18% from July's peak. The drop sent energy stocks lower, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 42 points to close at 11,284. The Nasdaq fell 25 points to close at 2285. The presidential candidates focused their energy on energy today. In Lansing, Michigan, Democrat Barack Obama dropped his opposition to tapping the strategic oil reserve. He also said again that he would agree to limited offshore drilling as part of a broader compromise. But Obama charged that Republican John McCain would go too far.
Now, after years of inaction, in the face of public frustration over rising gas prices, the only energy proposal he's really promoting is more offshore drilling, a position he recently adopted that's become the centerpiece of his plan, and one that will not make a real dent in current gas prices or meet the long-term challenge of energy independence.
McCain answered in Lafayette Hill, Pennsylvania. He urged Congress to call off its August recess and return to Washington to pass major energy legislation. And he asked for Obama's help in making that happen.
I call on Senator Obama to call on Congress to come back into town and come back to work, come off their recess, come off their vacation, and address this energy challenge to America, and don't leave until we do. Republican and Democrat joining together. And a very vital part of that is nuclear power, and another vital part of that is offshore drilling. We have to drill here and drill now.
We'll have more on the campaign energy debate right after this news summary. Former President Clinton today denied making racist remarks about Barack Obama during the Democratic primaries. He spoke to ABC's Good Morning America. Mr. Clinton also said that his wife, Senator Hillary Clinton, faced a different standard and tougher coverage than Obama in their contest. Questions about the long-running Anthrax investigation kept coming today. The prime suspect, Bruce Ivins, committed suicide last week as federal prosecutors were ready to charge him in the 2001 attacks. News accounts today told of doubts about the evidence and about Ivins working at an Army lab even as investigators focused on him. The Justice Department was said to be near closing the case, allowing the release of key documents. We'll have more on this story later in the program tonight. A military jury began deliberating the case against Osama bin Laden's former driver today. Salih Hamdan is accused of conspiracy and aiding al-Qaeda in the trial at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. He could get life in prison if he's convicted. 2 American soldiers were killed in Iraq today. They died in a roadside bombing in eastern Baghdad. On the political front there, a top member of parliament reported a tentative deal to let provincial elections take place this fall. It could be voted on tomorrow. An attack in western China killed 16 border police officers today, 4 days before the Summer Olympics open in Beijing. It happened in the city of Kashgar in Xinjiang province. Police said that 2 men drove a dump truck into the officers and then threw grenades. We have a report from Lindsay Hilsum of Independent Television News.
Chinese television mentioned the incident only briefly. Although the government has long said terrorism is the greatest threat to the Olympics, it's reluctant to draw attention to bad news. Last week, a video emerged from a group claiming to have carried out recent small bombings in China and threatening attacks against the Olympics. The turbaned man, who called himself Commander Saifullah, said he represented a Uyghur group called the Turkestan Islamic Party. The last major terrorist attacks in Xinjiang were in the 1990s, when the separatist East Turkestan Islamic movement killed several dozen people in bomb attacks. Some terrorism experts say the two groups are linked. In June, the Olympic torch was taken to Kashgar amidst heightened security. Many Uyghurs resent Chinese rule, and such is the government's fear of separatist attacks that shops were shut and only specially vetted people allowed to watch the torch as it passed. Today, the local public security department said it had intelligence that Uyghur separatists planned to attack just ahead of the Olympic Games. The government is taking extreme security measures. 110,000 troops, police and security volunteers have been posted to Beijing, with extra checks on aircraft arrivals, especially from Xinjiang.
Chinese President Hu Jintao made no mention of the attack in a speech today. Instead, he said the Olympics will show that China wants to join the world in building a bright future. A top Syrian general close to President Bashar Assad was assassinated over the weekend. Arabic newspapers and websites reported a sniper killed Brigadier General Mohammed Suleiman at a beach resort. The Syrian government refused all comment on the reports. The U.S. and 5 other world powers agreed today to seek more UN sanctions against Iran over its nuclear program. The Iranians failed to meet a weekend deadline for responding to a package of incentives. Instead, they said today that they will have a written response tomorrow. 2 Dutch climbers were rescued alive today from an avalanche disaster in Pakistan. At least 11 other mountaineers were feared dead on the world's second tallest peak. The weekend incident happened on K2, located near Pakistan's northern border with China. Bad weather forced helicopter crews to delay rescuing a 3rd climber until tomorrow. Tropical storm Eduardo closed on the Gulf Coast today. It was crossing warm water off Texas and Louisiana, and forecasters predicted it could grow into a hurricane. Emergency teams were activated, and landfall was expected sometime Tuesday morning. Tributes to famed Russian writer and dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn poured in today. He died of heart failure on Sunday in Moscow. Solzhenitsyn was himself a political prisoner in the Soviet Union. Later, he exposed the system, most famously in the Gulag Archipelago. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970. The author was exiled in 1974 and lived in the U.S. until the fall of the Soviet Union. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was 89 years old. We'll have more on his life at the end of the program tonight. Between now and then, an energy debate, the Anthrax investigation, and athletes and air quality in Beijing. The presidential candidates clashed over energy policy today, and we get the views of both campaigns. First, former U.S. Energy Secretary Federico Pena. He serves as Barack Obama's national campaign co-chair, and he joins us now from Denver. Mr. Secretary, good to see you again.
Thank you, Judy.
First of all, does Senator Obama believe that there is a short-term fix for high gasoline prices?
There are no short-term fixes. There are short-term efforts we can take to begin to reduce world crude oil prices. But the real solution is to understand we cannot drill our way out of this problem, but to begin to invest in alternative fuels and to gradually get us off the use of oil. That's the long-term strategy.
If he doesn't believe that the country can drill its way out of the problem, why did he change his position in the last few days and now say he is willing to go along with some offshore drilling?
Well, Judy, he hasn't really changed his position. What he said some months ago was he was against offshore drilling by itself. But recently, a group of senators, the group of 10, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, came up with a very interesting strategy which involved eliminating the tax reductions for the oil and gas companies, taking that money, investing it in clean energy, alternative fuels, and some other conservation efforts which Senator Obama has been supporting. That's the main thrust of that bill, and limited offshore drilling. So in the context of a comprehensive approach, Senator Obama said he would be open to limited offshore drilling. But let's be very clear, we cannot drill our way out of this problem.
Now, he's also said, as you just referred to, that he wants to levy a windfall profits tax on the large oil companies. How would he calculate that?
Well, there's a formula that's used, and that is to recognize that oil and gas companies have made profits in excess of what they normally would have achieved because of technology, innovation, or investment. So the idea here is to allow the oil and gas companies to keep a certain level of profits. Added to that would be profits to be used for further investment, because you don't want to discourage them from making further investment. And then any excess profits above that would be rebated to the government and given to consumers. And what the senator is proposing is a $1,000 energy rebate to couples and $500 for individuals to help defray the increasing costs of gas, food, health care, education costs, all the kinds of pressures that everyday consumers are facing today. And that's the approach that he's taking.
Now, again, on just circling back quickly to this question of drilling, some of the environmentalists who were supporting this compromise that some members of Congress had come up are pointing out that that is the one part of that package, that compromise package, that was mandatory. They're asking why was it that Senator Obama was not prepared to give on some of the more voluntary parts of the package?
Well, again, it's a compromise solution, but the idea here is that it reflects Senator Obama's position, which is we cannot drill our way out of this problem. We've got to invest, as he's proposing, $15 billion a year in alternative fuels, in alternative technology. We've got to increase our corporate average fuel economy to make our cars more fuel efficient, and he's proposing a 4% increase per year over a number of years. We've got to continue to invest in energy efficiency, helping people retrofit their homes, major companies retrofitting their buildings, increasing investment in capturing heat from major manufacturing plants and using that again to generate more electricity. He wants to support a renewable portfolio standard, which means that by the year 2012, 10% of our electricity would be produced from green energy, solar, wind, etc. So it's a comprehensive approach with the concept and the idea being getting us off this idea that we can simply drill our way out of this problem, which we have failed to do for 40 years. We've made the same mistake, and relied on the same concept for 40 years. It's not working.
And just two other quick questions. Nuclear. What does the senator believe about nuclear power?
Well, he has said he will keep the nuclear option on the table if we can resolve the challenge of how we deposit the nuclear fuel rods. The idea in the past was Yucca Mountain. There's some issues with Yucca Mountain. We've got to find another solution. And if we can deal with that and deal with the security issues, he is very open to continuing to support nuclear power.
And again, in just a few seconds, his position now that he is in favor of tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Right, and that's consistent with what he has said in the past. What he was against in the past was a straight sale of the oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which used to be done years ago to balance the federal budget. What he is willing to accept is a sale and then a later swap to put that oil back into the ground so we will have it for security purposes. President Bush did that before our first Persian Gulf war. President Clinton did that in the year 2000 when we had the home heating oil crisis, and there was a slight reduction in crude prices as a result of that swap. But let's be clear, that is not a long-term solution. It's a temporary solution.
All right, Secretary Pena, we're going to come back to you in just a moment, but let's turn now to Nancy Pfotenhauer. She is a top policy advisor to Senator John McCain. She's also former president of the Independent Women's Forum. She joins us from campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Nancy Pfotenhauer, first question, the same one I posed to Secretary Pena. Does Senator McCain believe there is a short-term fix to high gasoline prices?
Well, Judy, yes, I think we believe that there are things you can do in the short term and that will have midterm implications as well. And let me just start with the context that everyone agrees that we need alternative sources of energy. There's no presidential candidate that I'm aware of, certainly not Senator McCain or Senator Obama, who don't believe that we should be actively pursuing alternate sources of energy. They both support that. The problem is, as Senator Obama signaled, is that his approach is pie in the sky. He doesn't do anything in the short term, or I would argue even midterm, to affect supply issues. And that's why he's missing the entire boat, if you will. It's like having a huge empty swimming pool you're trying to fill, and he's going to fill it with a thimble and ignore the fire hose sitting right next to him. We need to increase domestic production, and we need to do it now. That the American people are aware of this. We've already seen the futures market and the signaling that's occurred that has helped lower prices, because President Bush and Senator McCain have actively called for it. So we definitely need to increase domestic production, and he's missing the whole ball game when he starts talking about these things that are 20, 30, 40 years out into the future that most people don't disagree with. We may disagree on how you get there, but we don't disagree with the goals, and Senator McCain has a 20-year history of being out ahead on things, on cap and trade, on CAFE standards, on all sorts of issues. So he's trying to put Senator McCain in a box he just can't put him in, and he's missing the most crucial aspect of the problem that we're facing right now, and that is how to increase supply.
So when you say Senator Obama's missing the point, or missing the boat, I think you said, on cap and trade and CAFE standards, in a nutshell, explain what you mean by that.
Oh, what I mean is he's missing the boat. He is refusing to embrace safe and known production methods of increasing domestic production that signals that we're going to change the supply situation that will lower gas prices. We've seen that effect already in play, because you've had Senator McCain out front exercising leadership, and you've seen the House and Senate Republicans and even some Democrats step forward and clamor to increase domestic production. The last thing you do, by the way, is increase taxes, which is what Senator Obama is advocating. He's advocating going the windfall profits tax route. If you tax something, you get less of it. I always say it's economic masochism to put a windfall profits tax in place, because you punish domestic producers, you reward foreign energy sources, so you increase our reliance on foreign oil, and you drive up the price for consumers.
So Senator Obama's plan to take that money and give it, as I believe Secretary Pena said, in a $1,000 rebate to American families, you're saying that's a mistake?
It doesn't solve, Judy, the underlying problem. It doesn't increase the supply of this product of gasoline, and therefore it won't affect prices over the long term. It's a redistributionist band-aid, if you will, and by raising prices on the sources of oil production that are domestic, you actually decrease supply. You do the exact opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. It's really a flawed approach, and it's Obamonomics, if you will, because he's taxing. If you tax something, you get less of it. He's going to tax production. We will get less of that, and we've tried it here. I mean, if it worked, I'd be in favor of it, but we tried it, and it decreased domestic production and it increased prices for consumers.
Coming back to the question of drilling, this is something that just a year ago Senator McCain had reservations about. So isn't it the case that both of these senators have moved in their thinking in terms of drilling for oil?
Well, it doesn't actually sound to me. I mean, I've tried to figure out where Senator Obama is on this. It doesn't sound to me like he's changed his position. He's pretty strongly against drilling and against domestic production. He gave an energy speech that I might point out is 2 months after Senator McCain laid out the Lexington Project in 5 separate speeches on this issue. But he he seems to be pretty firmly against drilling even now. Senator McCain was, absolutely clear about it the way he is. He said, look, I was against it in the past because I wasn't convinced that the technology existed to be able to do this in a way that was, protected environmentally pristine areas. Americans were not suffering under the burden of $4 a gallon gasoline. And we had evidence because we had survived some really fairly horrific storms with Katrina and Rita, and seen that the technology was pretty remarkable and that there were no significant spills during that period of time. So he said it was basically the duty, if you will, of from a leadership standpoint, to step forward and increase production.
Less than 30 seconds. Can you explain why Senator McCain opposes tapping the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
Well, you have to approach that with a lot of hesitancy if you look at things from a commander-in-chief perspective, because obviously it is established and it's only supposed to be tapped at times of crisis. And the fear, of course, is that if you tap it, you might be signaling people who have bad intentions, right, terrorists, if you will, whose goal is to disrupt supply, that we would be particularly vulnerable at that time. Now, I might point out that Senator Obama's plan to swap for heavier crude could, ironically enough, put us in the position where we're having to purchase oil from Chavez, who is not exactly the type of person we want to be dealing with.
All right, well, let's bring Secretary Pena back so we can get some response back and forth. Secretary, what about that last point, that if you swap this oil, a light sweet crude or light sweet oil for the heavier crude, right, you may put yourself in a vulnerable position?
Well, President Bush did it before the Persian Gulf invasion. President Clinton did it in the year 2000, and President Obama can do it too. And we've done it very safely and securely for many years. But if I might respond to some of the language that was used by your guest, first of all, let's be very clear. Senator McCain has opposed corporate average fuel economy for years. He's opposed investments in solar and wind and alternative fuels. And as was just stated, he was opposed to offshore drilling the last time he ran for president. Once he became a new candidate for president, he changed his position on that too. And secondly, I find it amazing that credit is being given to Senator McCain for the reduction in the price of crude oil. The fact is that demand is down. American consumers have they've slowed down their driving. And so demand is down, world demand is down, and that's why the world markets have responded, not because of a comment made by Senator McCain or by Senator Obama. These are market forces that are largely at work here. And the last point I want to make, and this is the fundamental difference we have to understand.
I was just going to ask Nancy Photenhauer to respond to those two, and then I'll come back to you. So hold that thought.
First of all, it's so funny because the Obama folks try to have it both ways. They try to portray Senator McCain as somehow being a puppet of big oil, which is laughable to anybody who has been in this town or watched his career. But the bottom line is he voted against the 2005 Bush-Cheney energy package that was a piñata of pork, if you will, to energy companies. Senator Obama voted for it. So they're really going to get a lot of pushback on that one from anybody who's honest or objective. And Senator McCain is the one he actually fashioned with John Kerry, the former Democratic presidential nominee, the bipartisan agreement on CAFE standards. Now, I will say that he had some hesitancy about pushing those CAFE standards or mileage standards, if you will, higher because it was going to kill Detroit, an auto industry that was already suffering.
What about those last 2 points, Secretary Pena?
Well, they're wrong. First of all, we doubled our fuel, laugh all you want, but I was around when we doubled our corporate average fuel economy in the 1970s. We doubled that both for vehicles and we increased it by 50% for trucks, and the auto industry did not die. We can do it again. And what Senator Obama is proposing is a $4 billion loan and other form of assistance to the big three to help them retool and produce these new vehicles for this generation. If Toyota can do it, General Motors can do it too. So let's be very realistic about where we can go here. But again, this is a difference of long-term solutions and finally getting us off of oil and understanding we cannot drill our way out of this problem.
Secretary Pena, very quickly, a response to what Nancy Photenhauer said about if you tax the oil companies, you're going to decrease production, hurt production.
The oil and gas companies made $140 billion in profit last year. What the senators are proposing is that we eliminate the tax reductions that were in place some time ago. And by the way, Senator McCain is proposing another $4 billion in tax relief for the oil and gas companies. And I didn't interrupt you, so please don't interrupt me. And this is the last industry that needs to have a tax break. The people who need a tax break are the working men and women of this country.
Nancy Pfotenhauer, last word.
Senator McCain has proposed lowering the corporate tax rate across all industries because we have a rate of 35%, which is significantly above our competitor nations. We're competing with countries like Ireland that have a rate that's less than half our corporate tax rate. It's exactly what we need to do, and it's why folks like Jason Furman, who are Senator Obama's top economic advisor now, was in favor of reducing the corporate tax rate a month before he went on board. And it's why Senator Obama has even signaled that it needs to come down. So you're cherry picking and being selective. It's not accurate.
We are going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank both of you, Nancy Pfotenhauer, former Secretary Federico Pena. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Margaret Warner has our update on the Anthrax investigation.
New details emerged this weekend about Bruce Ivins, the Army scientist who committed suicide last week after learning he was the prime suspect in the 2001 anthrax attacks that killed 5 people. Ivins worked with anthrax at the Army's Fort Detrick lab in Frederick, Maryland. This weekend, 2 very different portraits of the scientist came to light. The first came from a tape of his therapist at a court hearing 10 days ago when she sought a protective order against Ivins.
As far back as the year 2000, the respondent has actually attempted to murder several other people, either through poisoning. He plots and actually tries to carry out revenge killing. I'm scared to death.
She said that at a session on July 9th, he outlined a plan to kill his co-workers.
He was extremely agitated, out of control. He was going to go out in a blaze of glory.
But some neighbors and co-workers painted a very different picture.
Bruce is very involved in the community and in his church, and it would seem way out of character for that.
There was also some skepticism this weekend about the government's 7-year-long investigation. After first naming a different Fort Detrick scientist a person of interest in the case, the government gave Stephen Hatfill a financial settlement last month of $5 million. Former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, whose office was a target of the attacks, expressed his reservations on Fox News Sunday.
From the very beginning, I've had real concerns about the quality of the investigation, given the fact that they already paid somebody else $5 million for the mistakes they must have made. Gives you some indication of the overall caliber and quality of the investigation, and I'm hopeful that someday soon we'll have the answers we deserve.
The Department of Justice has said it won't discuss the case publicly until court documents are unsealed and victims' families have been updated.
And for the latest, we turn to Scott Shane. He's covering the story for the New York Times. Scott, thanks for being with us. How close is the government now to letting the public know what it knows about Bruce Ivins and whether, in fact, he is the anthrax killer?
We don't know for sure. We know that they're working on getting grand jury secrecy lifted from the investigation, declaring the investigation closed, and getting a judge to essentially give permission to make information that's been secret public. They're talking about possibly doing it as early as Wednesday, but no time has been set. In the meantime, they're contacting the family members of those 5 people who died of the anthrax and the 17 survivors because Robert Mueller, the FBI director, has promised to brief them before the public gets the information.
Now, what have you learned in the past few days since the story broke about why the FBI zeroed in on Ivins in particular and how long he's been the special focus?
Well, the anthrax investigation has been going on, of course, for almost 7 years. And at the very beginning, the FBI, by its own admission, was fairly clueless about what they now call microbial forensics, the idea of using the genetic and other attributes of the bacteria to trace it back to a source. but they developed a lot of science over the first few years of the investigation. And certainly by about 2005, they had been able to track the anthrax to Fort Detrick, the Army's lab in Frederick, Maryland. Now, at that point, they had a supply of anthrax they could match to the letters, but quite a number of people had access to the lab. I'm told that about 10 people used it regularly, and perhaps several times that number had passed through it at various times. So the FBI then began the painstaking process of trying to eliminate the people who'd worked in that lab. About a year and a half ago, they began to focus intensively on Bruce Ivins. This was partly because they had eased up on a focus that had lasted for 2 or 3 years on Stephen Hatfill, another scientist at the Fort Detrick lab, who had worked there from 97 to 99. Dr. Ivins continued to work at the lab up until his suicide last week. The FBI kept him under surveillance, followed him around in vans for at least a year. They interviewed his family, his colleagues, and they have convinced themselves that he was the anthrax mailer. Now, having focused so intensely on Hatfill, on Dr. Hatfill, and then just in June, having paid Dr. Hatfill about $5 million after deciding it wasn't he who had mailed the anthrax spores, there's certainly reason to be cautious in pinning that biological attack on Dr. Ivins, who is no longer around to defend himself.
How close were they to actually bringing an indictment against him? There have been conflicting reports on that.
I'm told that they were still planning to have witnesses before the grand jury this week and perhaps next week. It sounded like they were probably a few weeks away from indicting him, although they expected to indict him. They pulled some computers from a public library in Frederick after his death last week, which also suggested that they were still trying to shore up the case against him.
Now, as Ivins came under greater and greater suspicion, and you said they've been really focusing on him for a year and a half, yet he retained his security clearance all this time. How does the FBI explain that?
Well, they didn't really have the grounds to pull his security clearance unless they believed that they could charge him with this crime. And, of course, he committed suicide before they charged him. So we don't know how close they were. I think one indication of the situation that they found themselves in was, as we've heard, his therapist made statements that he had ranted about killing a large number of people and killing himself. But even after learning of that, the FBI did not feel they were able to arrest him at that time, which, obviously if they'd had sufficient evidence to charge him, would have been a prudent thing to do.
So it was the day after that, at least the meeting at which she says this occurred, that they did bar him from the lab. Were those two related?
Yes, they did bar him from the lab after he was believed by colleagues to be a danger to himself and possibly to others. And he spent almost 2 weeks in a mental health facility in Frederick, Maryland.
All right, Scott Shane, more to come, of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now another in our series of stories about the Olympics and China's moment on the world stage. Tonight, Beijing's problems with air pollution. After several days of clearer skies, a thick haze covered the city today, just 4 days before the opening ceremonies. Health correspondent Betty Ann Bowser has our story. The health unit is a partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Smog has been a fact of life in Beijing for years. It's so bad on some days that locals refer to it as the fog. But even after the Chinese government spent $17 billion trying to clean it up, and just days away from opening ceremonies, this is what the sky looks like much of the time. On July 20th, the government banned half of the city's 3 million cars from the streets, closed factories, and halted most construction, hoping it would reduce the levels of pollution.
Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. And then 2 or 3 days later, the situation worsened and the level of air pollution essentially doubled.
Kenneth Ron is an atmospheric chemist who regularly travels to China to consult with officials on how to deal with air pollution.
This slide shows what a blue sky day can be like in Beijing. If you look carefully down here, and this, you can see your shadow. At least you can see the shadows of the trees, and that qualifies it as a blue sky day. Obviously, there's no blue sky around. Maybe if you look straight up, you could see something that's not shown in this picture. The point is, the blue sky days do not automatically mean deep blue skies in the way that we in the West are accustomed to.
So this would be considered a pretty good day for competition by the Chinese?
Maybe borderline, but still acceptable, yeah.
A big part of China's problem stems from its rapid industrialization. Farmland has given way to factories that make cement and steel and spew pollutants. It burns more coal than any nation on Earth. All this makes for a toxic mix, and what makes it worse is Beijing's location.
The three worst pollutants are particulate matter, that's suspended particles, very fine particles, ozone, and nitrogen dioxide. Beijing is a very dry area, and it has a lot more particulate matter in its air than most cities do. Beijing is right next to a big desert. It's just over the mountains is a big Gobi Desert. It's very dry. There's dust all over the places. And if you have, anytime you have a little whirlwind, for example, you see a little spout of dust flying up in the air. It can be quite strong.
But the biggest problem right now is Beijing's summer weather patterns, which blow air pollution to the city from the southern industrialized provinces.
On the order of 70% of the material is coming from outside the city. And this can mean far outside the city. It means at least the first ring of provinces to the south. We're talking about hundreds of miles away. And it is effectively impossible or extremely difficult to lower the emissions from those provinces.
So the pollution hovers over the city for days until a cold front from Mongolia comes down from the north and blows it out. Then a few days later, more pollution from the southern provinces comes in, and the whole cycle starts over again. Many of the competing athletes are worried about this. U.S. Olympic mountain biker Adam Craig knows better than most what air pollution in Beijing can do to an endurance athlete.
I've never had any experience even remotely close to what I had in Beijing last fall.
Last September, he was in the Chinese capital to compete in a series of pre-Olympic warm-up races.
It's a weird bronchospasm thing that I was getting, that just whenever you try to take enough breath to give your muscles that fuel of oxygen they need, your bronchioles just start spasming and you just physically can't do it. And it's akin to drowning or something, just not being able to take that full breath and having your body really require that oxygen and not be able to get it is a pretty unique and pretty terrifying situation, I think.
Just 30 minutes after the starting gun of the race, Craig had to quit, but he had lots of world-class company.
The current world champion and the current Olympic champion, Julian Absalon, same deal, about the same point in the race, 20 or 30 minutes in, actually was sick to his stomach and threw up and was hacking and wheezing and had to pull out. And yeah, I think there were 46 starters and 8 finishers. So that's a pretty high attrition rate for a 2-hour mountain bike race around a fairly easy course.
Dr. David Christiani is a professor of occupational medicine and epidemiology at Harvard School of Public Health. He visits China twice a year for research on smog.
Exposure to high levels of toxicants like that in the air of Beijing, the initial response will be for these tubes to constrict, to go into spasm.
With a model of a lung, he showed us what happens when you inhale polluted air.
Even a healthy, high-performance athlete, much better physical condition than the rest of us, can experience immediately or in the short term this bronchospasm, can start to develop phlegm from inflammation from days or weeks of working out, and it can significantly decrease their performance.
That's why Ethiopia's long-distance gold medalist and world record holder Haile Gebrselassie decided not to compete in his event, the 26-mile-long marathon.
I don't compete the marathon because, it's already I decide.
Because he has exercise-induced asthma, Gebre Selassie chose instead to run the shorter 10,000 meters. He's disappointed he had to make that call.
I want to compete in the marathon because marathon is something very important for me, for my country. People of Ethiopia, they love, just to see someone to win, marathon in one of those Olympics.
Dr. Christiani says Gebre Selassie did the right thing.
He made a good decision because he's particularly susceptible to not just having lower performance, a longer time, off by minutes or seconds in a marathon, but he's at risk for having precipitating an acute asthma attack that could really severely adversely affect his health. And
Could it be life-threatening?
Potentially, yes. But even short of life-threatening, he could wind up in the hospital and quite sick.
Good job, Bri.
Randy Wilbur is the lead exercise physiologist for the United States Olympic Committee.
Beijing is certainly a significant challenge in terms of all of the issues that we face to try to help our athletes perform optimally.
He's training the athletes to deal with Beijing's heat and humidity, but says there's no way to prepare them for bad air.
You cannot physiologically, but you can get them prepared for a worst-case scenario. The best strategy is the alternate training site. Stay away from it. Do not expose yourself to it to avoid a cumulative negative effect.
So in these days leading up to Beijing, U.S. Olympic athletes are living and training far from the Chinese capital. The USA track and field teams are 300 miles away in the Chinese city of Dalian. And nearly 3,000 miles from Beijing, Singapore, is where the USA swimming and modern pentathlon teams are getting ready. Adam Craig and his U.S. mountain biking team are 600 miles away in South Korea.
We're going to go check in at the Olympic Village and then get out of Beijing. And we're going to come a day or two before the event, practice the course, get back out of Beijing again, and then just come the day of the event, compete in the event, and then leave.
The U.S. Olympic Committee says it will have face masks available for the 596 U.S. athletes competing in Beijing if they want to wear them. But Dr. Christiani says they won't do much good.
There's just no way they can compete with them on, so it's not effective. In between events, if they try to wear them, it will also, I think, not be particularly effective.
For the next few weeks, the world will be focused on the games. But when all the athletes go home and the crowds disperse, 17.4 million people will still be living in Beijing, with long-term consequences from air pollution.
You can get chronic bronchitis, asthma, aggravation of asthma, and scarring of the lung. And interestingly enough, not only is the lung affected, but those same pollutants, when they deposit in these areas and cause those responses like inflammation, also get in the bloodstream. Heart disease can be accelerated with air pollution. Other conditions such as stroke and peripheral vascular disease are accelerated by chronic exposures.
Last week, the Chinese government banned all construction in Beijing, another 10% of the city's private cars from the streets, and said it would take more drastic measures if necessary.
Scientist Kenneth Ron is taking your questions on China's pollution problems in an online forum. To participate, visit us at pbs.org. Finally tonight, remembering Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Jeffrey Brown has the story.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn was first a prisoner in the Soviet Union's vast Gulag system, and then a writer who exposed the horrors of that system to the world. He was born into the first generation following the 1917 Russian Revolution and served in the Red Army during World War II. But in 1945, he was arrested by Joseph Stalin's secret police. His crime, disparaging the Soviet dictator in a letter to a friend. In 1962, during the short-lived liberalization under Nikita Khrushchev, Solzhenitsyn was permitted to publish One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The searing tale of the struggle to survive a winter's day's imprisonment drew international acclaim. Solzhenitsyn would go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, but renewed scrutiny and then censorship from the Soviet state. His most famous work, The Gulag Archipelago, part memoir, part history of the prison system, in which millions of Russians lost their lives, was smuggled out of the Soviet Union on microfilm and first published in the West. One of Solzhenitsyn's sons spoke today of his father's motivation in writing.
The misery of people here and the lack of freedom under the Soviet regime, their impoverishment after the Soviet regime, was always a source of great pain to him. That is why he opposed the Soviet regime.
Solzhenitsyn was charged with treason in 1974 and forced to leave his country. He lived in the United States for almost 20 years and continued to write about the Soviet Union while also criticizing what he saw as the failings of the West. In 1994, he received a hero's welcome upon return to his native land. It was there that Alexander Solzhenitsyn died yesterday outside Moscow, as his wife said he had wished, at home in the summer. He was 89 years old.
And more now from Michael Scammell, a biographer of Solzhenitsyn, translator of many Russian literary works, and author of a forthcoming biography of the writer Arthur Koestler. And Nina Khrushcheva, a professor of international affairs at the New School and author of Imagining Nabokov, Russia Between Art and Politics. She's the great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Well, Michael Scammell, can you take us back in time to give us a sense of the power and impact of Solzhenitsyn's works when they first appeared? What did they do?
Well, you have to realize that the censorship of the Soviet Union was extremely expert and extremely professional, so that anything that was coming out of official literary circles had been thoroughly vetted beforehand and was generally dead and dull. When Solzhenitsyn managed to publish One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, it exploded like a bomb. And it had people in Moscow and even in the Soviet provinces saying, the Soviet censorship is gone, censorship is dead, we're approaching a new era. Well, of course, that wasn't true. The censorship was softened for a short period, particularly while Nikita Khrushchev was in power, but it was gradually reinforced. And unfortunately, one of the reasons that it was the success of Solzhenitsyn in reaching not only a very wide public in the Soviet Union, but a worldwide public as well.
Let me ask Nina Khrushcheva, you were a student, I understand, at the time when he was sent into exile. What do you remember of that time, and how do you assess his impact?
I was in school. It wasn't even middle school. I remember I was very, very young. But the impact was tremendous. I remember we were walking the school corridors, and everybody was buzzing about the fact that Alexander Solzhenitsyn was ousted out of the country, and he was declared a traitor. And I'm sure that everybody felt something more than just what was declared by the authorities. And I remember our teacher was saying he was a horrible man. He betrayed the country. The writer shouldn't behave this way. But since I was brought up in a family where Solzhenitsyn was a hero, where the One Day of Ivan Denisovich was read, and I already read it by then, I'm pretty sure I struggled very hard, I guess, to reconcile these two absolute polarities. One is that Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a great writer, and my great-grandfather thought of him as a genius. And then my Soviet school, where I was told that he was a horrible traitor and it was unseeming to a Russian writer to behave this way.
Mr. Scammell, what about the man himself? He grew up in this system. What was there about him, in addition to his experience, of course, in the camps, that turned him into this great truth teller? Well, ironically, he was an idealist. As a very young man, he believed in the system. He believed in what he was told by the Soviet regime. He believed in true communism. And what he discovered, of course, through his experiences was that true communism was a distant ideal, and that the Soviet regime had turned into virtually its opposite.
But like many idealists, he wasn't prepared just to stop there. He had a burning desire both to expose this hypocrisy and to bear witness to what he himself had experienced, particularly in the labor camps. And this witness took the form of stories like A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich we've heard about, but also in two magnificent novels, The First Circle, which described his 3 years in a special camp just outside Moscow, and Cancer Ward, in which he chronicled his experiences when he was very close to death with cancer himself.
And then, Ms. Kristeva, in the most famous work in the Gulag Archipelago, it is a mix of memoir and of history. He called it an experiment in literary investigation. What did he mean by that?
Well, this book, I think, is probably one of the greatest Solzhenitsyn's books, and he's going to go into history is the greatest writer of the 20th century, Russia. And what Michael Scammell said just now was very important. I think Solzhenitsyn's incredible talent, a genius really, was that he was a great witness. He wrote what he saw. And because he was such a talented witness, I think this book, as an experiment or as a new literary genre, and actually in this, Solzhenitsyn wasn't particularly very original because all great Russian writers always come up with a new genre and then make them into something that then the world basically stunned by and in awe of. I mean, you know, Gogol created new genres, Pushkin and whatnot, and Solzhenitsyn did indeed do the same. But it wasn't a diary. It was just an incredible witness, monolithic account of the horrors of Stalinism. And I think that is probably the greatest monument of Solzhenitsyn's legacy that would be left behind.
Mr. Scammell, as we said, he came to the U.S. He lived largely as a recluse. I think you met him here. Yes. He got most attention, really, for a famous speech at Harvard in which he was critical, very critical of the West. What happened? What was that about?
Well, I think that his main impulse in making that speech was to inform the West what was needed for Russia, what was needed to rescue Russia from the Soviet Union. And that was his overwhelming concern. When he lived in Vermont, he shut himself away in his study, mainly so that he could write his series of historical novels called The Red Wheel, to explain, he hoped, the origins of the Soviet Revolution. But his main concern was to find ways to encourage the West, to help the West, and to help the Russian people get rid of that system. In my view, his remarks on the West, which caused so much controversy, were almost throwaway remarks. Solzhenitsyn was not interested in America for its own sake. He wasn't interested in Western democracy for its own sake. He was interested in what they could do to help Russia get free of the Soviet tyranny. And to that extent, I think it wasn't exactly that he was misreported, but he didn't understand the Western media, and he didn't understand what would be seized upon and commented upon the most. In this case, it was his rather disparaging remarks about America and about the West in general.
And just in our last minute, Ms. Kristeva, he went back to Russia. He had a hero's welcome, but that didn't last either. How will he be remembered, do you think, in Russia?
It didn't last either because Solzhenitsyn was he was sort of one-line man, so to speak. I mean, maybe he wasn't interested in the West per se, but he was very interested in Russia as a unique civilization. And therefore, as everybody who thinks that Russia is a unique civilization, the West is by definition an enemy. So I actually think it's fair to say that he was remarkably critical of the West. When he came to Russia and saw what democratic, and I put it in quotes, that's how he believed democratic Russia was under President Yeltsin, he was even more disparaged because he felt that it was the West's fault in many ways that Russia ended in that particular situation. And his message of pushing Russia into greatness really didn't lay well with the Russian public at the time.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Nina Kristova and Michael Scammell, thank you both very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Again, the major developments of the day. The price of oil hit its lowest point in 3 months, below $121.50 a barrel. And Democrat Barack Obama dropped his opposition to tapping the strategic oil reserve. Republican John McCain called for a special session of Congress on energy policy. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you and good night.
Major funding for the News Hour with Jim Lehrer is provided by...
We are explorers. Humans are. Today there is a new frontier to explore. Energy. We're trying to find it in ways once unimaginable, mapping uncharted territory 5 miles below the sea, long before a single mark is ever put in the ground. So we drill more intelligently, more respectfully, to power the new explorers. This is the power of human energy.
Pacific Life. The Atlantic Philanthropies. And with the ongoing support of these institutions and foundations. And
this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Trusted, in-depth, independent. This is PBS.